A dispute erupts in Europe as Italy accuses France of impoverishing African nations. Can liberal Western-style democracy work on the continent? We'll tell you about the results of a new study. And former Nigerian Vice President Atiku Abubakar discusses his political plans with Voice of America's Peter Clody. Africa 54 starts right now.
Good evening and welcome. I'm Vincent McCory. This is Africa 54. A simmering dispute between two European Union nations has emerged from the shadows. Italy's deputy prime minister is accusing France of impoverishing African countries. The accusation has created a rift between the two nations. At the heart of the row is migration into Europe, following the deaths of hundreds of refugees in the Mediterranean Sea off the coast of Libya in very recent days. As Henry Ridgwell reports, the argument is likely to peak into the bitter divisions that will be laid bare across the continent in the run-up to European elections in May.
Already frosty relations between Paris and Rome have taken an icy turn. France summoned the Italian ambassador to explain these comments made Sunday by Italy's deputy prime minister.
If today we still have people leaving Africa, it's due to several European countries, first of all France, that didn't finish colonizing Africa.
Di Maio accused France of impoverishing 14 African countries that use the CFA franc, a colonial-era currency underpinned by the French treasury, and forcing people to flee to Europe.
The actual benefits of the CFA franc are disputed by economists. However, Di Maio's criticisms aren't really valid. Now, there's two reasons for that. One of them being that people arriving into Italy at the moment, the latest data suggests they are not from countries using the CFA franc. And the second point is that in any case, if countries remain poor, migration is actually lower.
The Franco-Italian dispute follows the drowning of hundreds of migrants off Libya in recent days. The deaths have renewed the focus on Italy's decision to end search and rescue operations in the Mediterranean and the EU's failure to share refugee quotas.
Italy wanting France to take migrants who arrive on its shores, or at least part of them, and also disagreements over how to handle Libya, with Italy and France backing different sides in the Libyan civil war.
President Macron has not responded directly. He has sought to renew EU momentum with a new Franco-German treaty signed Tuesday in the border town of Aachen.
Les eurosceptiques, les nationalistes.
The Eurosceptics, nationalists, benefit from the fear in Europe's people, and they say the answer on your fears is nationalism, and we don't believe this.
The dispute is a taste of what's to come as populist forces like Italy's Five Star and La Liga join battle with pro-Europeans.
This contraposition has been created whereby Italy is the populists and Macron is the Europeanist, and it suits both sides in a sense to have each other as the bogeyman. Of course, this is especially important in light of the upcoming European Parliament elections.
Those election campaigns are expected to be bitter, with migration at the heart of the debate over Europe's future. Henry Ridgwell for VOA News, London.
The trafficking of women and girls is a serious problem in Nigeria. As many as 20,000 women and girls are feared to have been trafficked from Nigeria to Mali, where they are stranded after being forced into prostitution. That is according to the head of Nigeria's anti-trafficking agency. The Director General of the National Agency for the Prohibition of Trafficking in Persons said a fact-finding team from the agency and the International Organization for Migration had uncovered the extent of the trafficking during a visit to southern Mali last month. The women and girls, most aged 16 to 30, have been told they would be taken to Malaysia to work in hospitality, but instead were forced into prostitution. Democratic governance and leadership on the African continent continue to be the leading priorities for sub-Saharan Africa in 2019, according to a study published last week by the Brookings Institution's Africa Growth Initiative. But does a liberal Western-style democracy work for Africa? Africa 54's Paul Ndiho has more.
The Africa Foresight, a 2019 study conducted by the Brookings Institution, a Washington, D.C.-based non-profit organization devoted to independent research and policy solutions, says that governance and leadership should be the priority for Africa in 2019. Brahima Kuruble, a senior fellow at the Brookings, explains.
Democracy is consolidating, although the prevalence of tensions and in some countries violence suggests that there are areas for improvements. And the demographic tidal wave looms closer, but job creation has not been able to keep up. And despite continued progress on governance, more efforts are needed to eradicate corruption, and very importantly, to elevate the voice and representation of young people and women in decision-making.
Building governance and democratic institutions remains an uphill battle for most African nations. Western-style democracy is being tested across the continent, especially in countries where some of the world's longest-serving leaders continue to hold power. For example, in Uganda, incumbent President Yoweri Museveni has exploited ambiguities in the law to extend his term in office as head of state, while simultaneously undermining the nation's constitution. Earlier this month, the British Parliament held a historic debate on the state of democracy in Uganda.
Serious concerns have been raised internationally about the Ugandan government systematically undermining democracy in their country.
Vanda Felabab Brown, a senior fellow on foreign policy at Brookings, says that in some countries, the essence of democracy is solely about elections, appearing to undermine the broader meaning of democracy, which is accountability.
Democracy, in my view, should also be about human rights, civil liberties, and other mechanisms of accountability than simply elections. These other mechanisms of accountability having to do with how the government on a day-to-day basis is held accountable to the laws of the country.
Abebe Amero Salasi, director of the Africa Department at the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, says another critical area undermining democracy in Africa is corruption.
Lack of transparency often in how transactions take place, the weakness of institutions, and importantly also the impunity, as she calls it, or lack of accountability when corrupt incidents are found. So particularly the transparency side is something which we work on a great deal, and I think that's one of the ways in which we can help.
Linda Thomas Greenfield, a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, now a senior counselor at the Albright Stonebridge Group, says leadership is essential for Africa's economic development.
Can't stress enough the transformative effects of good leadership that is focused on delivering for the common man and doing what is right, irrespective of the political cost. And we're seeing some changes take place on the continent of Africa. We're seeing new leaders begin to step up to the forefront that we hadn't even thought of before. And Ethiopia comes to mind for me, and even what I see happening in Angola now.
Perhaps upcoming elections in Nigeria and South Africa offer a ray of hope to strengthen democracy and governance in two of Africa's biggest economies. Paul Ndiho, VOA News, Washington.
The former Nigerian Vice President Atiku Abubakar, who is running in the 2019 Nigerian presidential election, visited the Voice of America, where he was interviewed by Peter Clotty, host of VOA's Nightline radio broadcast. Abubakar, who is in the U.S. for the first time in more than 12 years, is challenging the incumbent President Muhammadu Buhari in the February 16th poll. Here are some excerpts from Peter's sit-down with the Nigerian presidential candidate.
Mr. Vice President, thank you very much for joining us today at the Voice of America.
Thank you, Peter, for inviting me.
I understand some investors want to come to Nigeria. How do you convince them?
The most important thing now is to get the Nigerian electoral process, on the right track. And then, of course, after the elections, we believe that the best, political party that will continue with very close, bilateral relationships with the United States is my political party, because in the first place we sign all those bilateral elections. I remember having come to U.S. a number of times to, to sign those bilateral relations. And since the departure of PDP, we have seen less of American involvement and presence in, various aspects, of our life, economic development. So we have come to pledge to renew, that partnership, with, the United States.
You talked about putting the electoral process on the right track. What does that mean, and what is your anticipation? How credible do you think these elections will be?
What I would have loved to see is to see the process that was used in 2015 to conduct that credible election is retained at this point in time, so that we also build on what we have achieved in 2015. But unfortunately, that's not what I am seeing, on the side of both the Electoral Commission in Nigeria and also on the side of government. We see government using, security services actually to undermine the electoral process. We see government also undermining the various institutions of checks and balances enshrined in our Constitution, also to undermine the electoral process. And we believe that our development partners need to also play a very, very significant role in making sure that we remain on track, just as we did in 2015.
So with some of these challenges that you've enumerated, and the power of incumbency, we all know incumbents in Africa are pretty much difficult to defeat. What realistically are your chances of defeating incumbent President Muhammadu Buhari?
The chances are there for everybody to see, because everybody is fed up with this administration. First of all, they came on three promises. One, to create jobs. Instead of creating jobs, they have lost 20 million jobs. It's the highest record of unemployment in Nigeria's history. They came to restore internal security. We have, in fact, the worst insecurity in Nigeria today. It was confined to the northeast. Today we have it in the northwest and also in the north central. All the international community knows that. So again, they have worsened the security situation. They have come to fight corruption. This is the worst, corruption we have ever seen. Even the Transparency International has now downgraded us, by several points. And I believe that they will definitely not return this government to power. The will of the electorate is stronger than any other thing you can imagine.
That was Peter Klote, host of VOA's Nightline radio show, speaking with Nigerian presidential candidate Atiku Abubakar. The annual World Economic Forum is underway in Switzerland against a backdrop of anxieties over trade disputes, Brexit, and growth slowdown that some fear could tip the world economy. VOA's Mariama Diallo reports.
Some 3,000 businesses, government, and ordinary citizens are meeting in the Swiss city of Davos this week. Klaus Schwab, the founder of the World Economic Forum, says that strengthening global cooperation is a must for the world economy, which has experienced a slow and uneven recovery since the global financial crisis in 2008.
I think we are walking on relatively thin ice because as our global risk report, which we published some days ago, has shown there are many threats to the global economy. I think it's very important to strengthen global cooperation. That's what we want to achieve here in Davos.
The WEF's own Global Risks Report set the tone this week with a stark warning of a looming economic downturn, in part because of geopolitical tensions among major powers. Several world leaders stayed away, including U.S. President Donald Trump, who's grappling with the country's longest government shutdown in U.S. history. But his Secretary of State Mike Pompeo addressed anxieties over a trade dispute with China during a video conference.
There are those who say that superpower conflict between our two countries is inevitable. We don't see it that way. We want to find places where we can work together.
Pompeo stressed that cooperation between the two countries can only work if some conditions are met.
Free and open seas, the capacity for nations to take their goods around the world, fair and reciprocal trade arrangements where every country has the opportunity to compete on a fair, transparent, and open basis.
Another leader who didn't attend was British Prime Minister Theresa May, who survived a no-confidence vote after her Brexit withdrawal agreement was recently rejected, an issue of concern for this attendee.
I think if we get a hard Brexit, the consequences are such that it will be a major disruption, and I think it's very difficult to prepare for that. So we're really hoping for and banking on the fact that the people will come to their senses and that we will have regimes that will ensure that we can continue the way that we're doing today.
While economic growth is slowing, the aid charity Oxfam warned the Davos elite that income inequality around the world is not. Mariama Diallo, VOA News.
But I want to know what you think about Africa 54 and the stories we cover. Join the conversation on Facebook. The address is Africa 54. You're also streaming our show live on Facebook, so check us out and share our show with your friends. Find me on Twitter at VOA Vince McCory. Still ahead on Africa 54, Senate leadership schedules votes on rival bills to end the partial U.S. government shutdown. But first, a look at Wednesday's headlines.
Sudan's embattled President Omar al-Bashir is in Qatar looking for support amid weeks-long protest against his 29-year rule in the African nation. In Zimbabwe, soldiers were still roaming the streets of Harare and assaulting people late Tuesday, despite President Emerson Mnangagwa denouncing their violence as unacceptable, according to witnesses. A memorial service is held in Nairobi, Kenya, to honor the 6 staff members who were killed in the terror attack on the hotel complex last week. We stay in Kenya, where the Agricultural and Livestock Research Organization looks to manage pollinators in the country, as scientists warn that the nation's poor agricultural practices are killing them.
An international conference on border security that was to be hosted by the U.S. State Department has been cancelled due to the partial shutdown of the government over border security. Now, the State Department says 250 experts on export control and border security from 85 countries were expected to participate in the conference scheduled for mid-February in Scotland. Border security is at the center of the fight between President Donald Trump and the Democrats that has paralyzed 25% of the federal government. President Trump is demanding $5.7 billion to build a wall along part of the U.S.-Mexico border that he says is crucial for America's national security. But the Democrats have rejected Trump's demand, creating over a month-long stalemate now. Senate Democratic and Republican leaders agreed Tuesday to schedule a vote on President Trump's wall funding bill, as well as a bill already passed by the House of Representatives to fund the government through February the 8th. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says the vote on both proposals will take place on Thursday, one day before federal workers are likely to miss their second paycheck since the shutdown began December 22nd. VOA's Laditza Hoke reports.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited the World Central Kitchen in Washington on Tuesday and greeted some of the federal workers affected by the shutdown. Chef Jose Andres is offering free meals to government employees who are not getting their paycheck. Ahead of a visit, Pelosi told reporters that the Democrats would not vote on Trump's plan until the government is reopened.
Cannot have the president, every time he has an objection, to say, I'll shut down government until you come to my way of thinking. Understand, that is part of the point of this. If we hold the employees hostage now, they're hostage forever.
Democrats in Congress also rejected Trump's offer to extend legal protections for immigrants who were brought to the United States illegally as children, pointing out that he was the one who had withdrawn those protections known as DACA.
It's like bargaining for stolen goods.
Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell said the Senate would vote on Trump's proposal on Thursday.
To reject this proposal, Democrats would have to prioritize political combat with the president
ahead of federal workers, ahead of DACA recipients, ahead of border security, and ahead of stable and predictable government funding.
Trump's hand was weakened Tuesday when the Supreme Court said it would not act on DACA, meaning the law would remain in place for some time. Later Tuesday, McConnell said the Senate would vote on both the Republican and Democratic proposals to end the shutdown. The decision marks a shift for McConnell, who has said that he would not allow votes on measures that the president would not sign. Either bill needs 60 votes to pass. If neither gets the needed bipartisan support, many more government employees may depend on free meals. Zlatica Hoke, VOA News, Washington.
As a stalemate over the longest U.S. government shutdown continues, Minnesota Representative Ilhan Omar held a press conference at the Minneapolis-St. Paul Airport to weigh in on the issue.
The president thinks he can use DACA recipients whose status is only threatened because of him as pawns in his quest to build a xenophobic and racist wall that's designed to keep immigrants out of this country. He thinks he can hold the salaries of hundreds of thousands of federal workers hostage to build the symbol of hate. Well, we're here to say, no way. We can talk about the best immigration policy, but we don't need to shut down our government to do it.
That was Minnesota Representative Ilhan Omar. 3 U.S. citizens of Kenyan descent are in custody after being charged with conspiring to support the Islamic State group. Authorities announced that they were arrested Monday at a Michigan airport as they checked in for a trip that would eventually take them to Mogadishu, Somalia, with the goal of joining the terrorist organization. The 3 men, all in their 20s and related to each other, allegedly recorded videos pledging their allegiance to Islamic State and discussed a potential car attack in the United States if one of them was unable to travel overseas to fight for the terror group. The men were detained as Muse Abdikadir Muse, 23, also known as Muse, was going through the TSA security screening process. Authorities say he had an online exchange with an undercover FBI agent. Muse allegedly said he wanted to join Islamic State in Somalia and fight on the front lines. Ghana produced about 900,000 tons of cocoa every year, making it the world's second largest exporter of the magic bean, second only to Ivory Coast. Until recently, most of that cocoa was exported out of Ghana, but today many local farmers want to keep it at home. VOA's Arash Arabasadi reports.
Chances are good that if you've ever had cocoa or chocolate, it came from one of the 900,000 or so cocoa farming families in Ghana. Farmers like Nicholas Narwarty say that instead of exporting their cocoa, farmers should be making their own chocolates.
We should be adding value locally to the cocoa. If demand increased locally, that would only help us. It would be better to produce the chocolate locally rather than exporting the beans.
Ghana is the world's second biggest cocoa exporter. But for farmers sending the raw cocoa overseas, the fruits of their labor are not as lucrative as making and selling their own chocolate.
The confectionery business has started on a humble note of approximately 2 to 5% of our output to start with, but we believe that the confectionery business or the confectionery section is the way to go. Basically, talking about value addition. So we know that is going to grow.
Niche is Ghana's leading chocolate exporter, distributing about 60 tons of semi-processed beans each year. The company started making its own chocolates in 2017. They now make 200 tons of finished chocolate goods each year, and that number is on the rise thanks in part to government help.
Any import you bring in, that's machinery, equipment, whatever, you don't pay any tax on them. No import tax on them. Number 2, you have 10 years moratorium for corporate tax.
But that really only helps large companies able to purchase machinery. The majority of Ghana's artisanal chocolate producers get zero government support and often operate in parts of the country without reliable electricity. What's made for now leaves small farmers still looking to export their crop outside of Ghana. Arash Arabasadi, VOA News.
Welcome back to Africa 54, and here's what's trending. Dotun Popula is working on his latest sculpture in Ile-Ife, a town of southwestern Nigeria's Osun state. The artist is fusing pieces from a broken generator, recycled kitchen utensils, and collector's scrap metal to create a metal fish. The 35-year-old sculptor likes to work primarily with scrap metal and says creating animal forms are his favorite way to use the medium. When he's not traveling or scouring junkyards, Dotun mentors aspiring artists. He says he wants to help encourage creativity and get youth to explore new ways to express themselves. Meanwhile, in Somalia, a team of workers, many of them refugees from Somalia's long conflict, collect plastic bags and bottles and wrappers for recycling in the capital, Mogadishu. They are part of workers recruited by Somali Enviro Green Company that processes plastic waste into roof tiles and other recycled goods. Somalia's cash-strapped government is struggling to control a vast, divided country where Islamist militants from the Al-Qaeda-linked Al-Shabaab group still control territory and launch regular guerrilla attacks on the capital. Regular rubbish collection is way down the state's list of priorities, so entrepreneurs are moving into to fill that gap in social services. Well, and finally, Facebook's WhatsApp is limiting worldwide the number of times a user can forward a message to 5 as the popular messaging service looks to fight misinformation and rumors. Previously, a WhatsApp user could forward a message to 20 individuals or groups. WhatsApp, which has around 1.5 billion users, has been trying to find ways to stop misuse of the app following global concern that the platform was being used to spread fake news, manipulated photos, videos without context, and audio hoaxes. And that's what's trending today. Well, and that's our show for today. Now be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. For more news, tune in to VOA's evening radio show, Africa News Tonight at 1800 UTC, and in the mornings to Daybreak Africa between 0300 and 0600 UTC. That's Monday through Friday. Thanks a lot for watching. From all of us here in Washington, have a good night.